On April 22nd, 1974, 5 people were taken into the basement of a small stereo store in Ogden, Utah during what began as an ordinary robbery. By the time the night was over, 3 of them would be dead, 2 would survive injuries that should have been fatal, and the crime scene would leave seasoned police officers shaken. This was not a crime of panic or desperation. It was planned, methodical, and carried out by men who believed no one would live to tell what happened. One person did, and because he survived, the truth of what happened in that basement would never be buried. On the evening of Monday, April 22nd, 1974, the city of Ogden, Utah, was settling into what most residents considered a normal and safe routine. Ogden sat along the western edge of the Wasatch Mountains, anchored economically and socially by Hill Air Force Base. The presence of the military shaped the town's identity. Many families had at least one connection to the base, and violent crime of the kind seen in major coastal cities felt distant and unlikely. Ogden was not a place where people expected calculated brutality. At 2325 Washington Boulevard stood the Hi-Fi Shop, a locally owned stereo store catering to the growing audiophile culture of the early 1970s. Inside were high-end turntables, reel-to-reel tape decks, amplifiers, and large wood cabinet speakers. The equipment was expensive, often worth thousands of dollars, and the store relied on trust, routine, and the belief that the community around it was safe. Working that night were 2 young employees. Stanley Walker was 20 years old. He was known as reliable, mechanically inclined, and serious about his job. Sherry Michelle Ansley was 18 years old, a senior at Clearfield High School, and only weeks away from graduation. Friends described her as friendly and upbeat. As the store approached closing time, the 2 began their usual end-of-day tasks, straightening displays and preparing to shut down for the night. Shortly before 6:30 p.m., a blue Chevrolet van pulled into the parking lot outside the Hi-Fi Shop. Inside were 3 airmen stationed at Hill Air Force Base: 21-year-old Dale Pierre Selby, 19-year-old William Andrews, and 18-year-old Keith Roberts. The 3 had planned to rob the store. They were armed, and they had come prepared to remove large amounts of equipment. What separated this crime from a typical robbery was the mindset of Dale Pierre Selby. Pierre had a history of disciplinary problems in the Air Force and was known by others as volatile and aggressive. In the weeks leading up to April 22nd, he had spoken openly about wanting to commit a robbery and leave no witnesses. Multiple people later told investigators that Pierre had referenced a recent viewing of the Clint Eastwood film Magnum Force, which includes a scene involving the use of drain cleaner as a weapon. Investigators and prosecutors believe this film influenced Pierre's thinking, though no single motive fully explains what followed. That evening, Pierre and Andrews exited the van and entered the Hi-Fi Shop, leaving Roberts behind in the driver's seat as a lookout. Once inside, Pierre and Andrews produced handguns, a .38 caliber revolver, and a .25 caliber pistol. There were no customers in the store. Only Stanley Walker and Sherry Ansley were present. At gunpoint, the 2 employees were ordered to move to the back of the store. They were forced down a narrow staircase into the basement. The basement was not a showroom or workspace. It was a storage area, poorly lit, cluttered with boxes, tools, and packing materials. Once there, Pierre and Andrews bound both Stanley and Sherry with heavy cord, tying their hands and feet. They were forced to lie face down on the floor. Upstairs, Pierre and Andrews began removing equipment from the store. They carried large speakers, amplifiers, and stereo components out to the van. The process was slow and physically demanding. Despite this, they did not rush. The victims remained bound in the basement while the robbery continued above them. During this time, an unplanned event occurred that permanently altered the scale of the crime. 16-year-old Courtney Naisbitt arrived at the Hi-Fi Shop. He was a local teenager and a friend of the employees. Seeing the store lights on, he entered through the front door, unaware that a robbery was in progress. Inside, he encountered William Andrews, who immediately drew a gun and took control of him. Courtney was forced at gunpoint down the same staircase into the basement, where he was bound and placed alongside Stanley and Sherry. The robbery continued. As time passed, Stanley Walker did not arrive home when expected. His father, Orrin Walker, became concerned. Rather than wait, Orrin drove to the Hi-Fi Shop to check on his son. When he arrived, he noticed the store lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. Inside, the showroom appeared empty. As Orrin called out for Stanley, he was confronted by Andrews, who was armed. Orrin was forced down the stairs into the basement, where he immediately saw his son bound on the floor. Orrin was ordered to lie down and was bound in the same manner as the others. Not long after, Carol Naisbitt, Courtney's mother, also arrived at the hi-fi shop. She had noticed her son's car parked outside and became alarmed when he did not return home. Like the others before her, she entered the store and was taken at gunpoint into the basement, where she was bound and placed with the rest of the victims. At this point, 5 people were restrained in the basement of the hi-fi shop: Stanley Walker, Sherry Ansley, Courtney Naisbitt, Orrin Walker, and Carol Naisbitt. The robbery itself was essentially complete. The van was nearly full of stolen equipment. Keith Roberts remained outside, unaware of the full extent of what was happening below, but knowing a robbery was underway. Instead of leaving, Dale Pierre made a decision that transformed the crime into something far worse. Pierre went to the van and retrieved a bottle of liquid Drano and a roll of duct tape. These items had been brought to the scene intentionally. When he returned to the basement, the situation changed from robbery to deliberate violence. According to later testimony, Pierre and Andrews began forcing the victims to ingest the caustic liquid. When victims resisted, they were restrained, threatened with firearms, and overpowered. After the liquid was poured into their mouths, strips of duct tape were placed tightly over their lips, preventing them from spitting it out or crying for help. Liquid Drano is designed to dissolve organic material. When it came into contact with the tissues of the mouth and throat, it caused immediate and severe chemical burns. Orrin Walker later testified that he heard a hissing sound in the room and could feel intense burning. The victims began to convulse, choking and struggling against their restraints. Despite this, Dale Pierre was not finished. While the others lay bound and severely injured, Pierre separated Sherry Ansley from the group. He ordered William Andrews away from the immediate area. In another part of the basement, Pierre sexually assaulted Sherry. This act occurred while the other victims were still alive and suffering nearby. Hours had passed since the robbery began. The attackers realized the poison was not killing the victims as quickly as Pierre had anticipated. The victims were critically injured, struggling to breathe, and in shock, but they were still alive. At that point, Dale Pierre decided to end their lives himself. He took his .38 caliber revolver and returned to the line of bound victims. Dale Pierre returned to the line of bound victims, holding his .38 caliber revolver. The basement of the hi-fi shop was dimly lit, filled with the smell of caustic chemicals and the sounds of labored breathing. The victims were incapacitated by chemical burns to their mouths and throats, their hands and feet tied, their ability to cry out eliminated by duct tape. Pierre began the executions. The first person he shot was Carol Naisbitt. Standing over her, Pierre fired a single round into her head. He then moved to her son, 16-year-old Courtney Naisbitt, and fired again, striking him in the head. Courtney collapsed, critically wounded but not immediately killed. Next was Stanley Walker. Pierre placed the revolver at the back of Stanley's head and pulled the trigger. Stanley was killed instantly. Pierre then turned to Sherry Ansley. After the assault and the chemical burn she had already endured, Pierre fired a single shot into her head, killing her. Finally, Pierre came to Orrin Walker. Pierre fired a round into the back of Orrin's head. The bullet tore through Orrin's jaw and exited without penetrating the brain or severing a major artery. Orrin collapsed but remained conscious. Despite catastrophic injuries and extreme blood loss, he did not cry out. He remained completely still, understanding that any sign of movement could result in another shot. Pierre initially believed Orrin was dead, but moments later, he noticed movement. Orrin's body showed signs of life. Angered that the gunshot had not finished the job, Pierre searched for another weapon. Nearby, he found a ballpoint pen. Pierre forced the pen into Orrin Walker's ear canal. When it met resistance, Pierre pressed harder. He then used his boot to stomp on the end of the pen, driving it through the eardrum and deep into the tissue of Orrin's throat. Orrin Walker remained silent. He did not scream or resist. He did not move. He continued to feign death despite being conscious unconscious and in extreme pain. Pierre kicked Oren one final time, watching for a reaction. Seeing none, he assumed all 5 victims were dead. Pierre and Andrews then turned off the basement lights and went back upstairs. They took a few remaining items from the store, exited through the front door, and returned to the blue van where Keith Roberts was waiting. The 3 men drove back toward Hill Air Force Base, transporting approximately $24,000 worth of stolen stereo equipment. The hi-fi shop was left unlocked and unattended. In the basement, silence followed. Orrin Walker remained motionless for several minutes, listening for any sign that the attackers might return. When he was certain they were gone, he began to move. Despite a gunshot wound to the head, a pen embedded in his throat, and severe chemical burns, he managed to shift his body and work at the cords binding his hands. Through sheer determination, Orrin freed himself. He crawled first to his son, Stanley Walker. Stanley showed no signs of life. Orrin then reached Sherry Ansley. She was also dead. When Orrin checked Carol and Courtney Naisbitt, he discovered that both were still breathing. They were critically injured, suffering from gunshot wounds and chemical burns, but they were alive. Orrin attempted to leave the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked from the outside. He was trapped underground with 2 deceased victims and 2 who were barely clinging to life. Above ground, concern was growing. Nan Walker, Orrin's wife, had become alarmed when both her husband and her son failed to return home. She drove to the hi-fi shop with another one of her sons. When they arrived, they found the store lights still on and the front door unlocked. Inside, the showroom was empty. As they moved toward the back of the store, they heard faint, distorted sounds coming from below. Orrin Walker, unable to climb the stairs, was calling out from the basement. Police were summoned immediately. When officers arrived, they forced open the basement door. What they encountered was one of the most horrific crime scenes in Utah history. The basement contained the bodies of Stanley Walker and Sherry Ansley, both deceased from gunshot wounds. Carol Naisbitt and Courtney Naisbitt were alive but critically injured. Orrin Walker was standing despite his injuries, covered in blood, with severe facial trauma and chemical burns. The smell of liquid Drano was overpowering. Officers later reported that it burned their eyes and lungs upon entry. Paramedics rushed the survivors to St. Benedict's Hospital. Medical staff worked urgently to stabilize them. The chemical burns had caused extensive damage to the victims' mouths, throats, and internal tissues. The gunshot wounds to the head were severe. Despite emergency surgery, Carol Naisbitt died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Orrin Walker survived, though his injuries were life-altering. Courtney Naisbitt also survived, despite having suffered a bullet wound to the head and massive internal damage from the chemical burns. As doctors fought to save the survivors, police began their investigation. The killers had left behind a trail of evidence that would lead investigators directly to them within hours. Within hours of the discovery at the hi-fi shop, the investigation began to move rapidly. The brutality of the crime shocked Ogden and immediately drew the attention of both local police and military authorities at Hill Air Force Base. Investigators understood early on that the perpetrators had been organized, armed, and familiar with the area. The first major break came from an unexpected source. 2 young boys living on Hill Air Force Base were playing near a dumpster when they noticed a discarded wallet and purse. Inside were identification cards belonging to Stanley Walker and Sherry Ansley. Recognizing that something was wrong, the boys turned the items over to base personnel, who immediately contacted Ogden police. This discovery placed the investigation squarely on Hill Air Force Base. At the same time, an Air Force supervisor had already grown suspicious. Earlier that night, 3 airmen had been seen unloading large quantities of stereo equipment into a barracks room and a nearby storage space. The amount and type of equipment were inconsistent with personal purchases and raised immediate concern. Ogden police coordinated with military authorities and began canvassing the base. Investigators quickly focused on 3 individuals: Dale Pierre Selby, William Andrews, and Keith Roberts. When officers approached Pierre and Andrews, both men displayed signs of nervous behavior. Witnesses later described them as pacing, watching investigators closely, and acting erratically. Based on the recovered personal items, witness statements, and the unusual presence of the stolen equipment, police obtained search warrants. The searches confirmed everything. In the barracks room and rented storage space associated with the suspects, officers recovered large speakers, amplifiers, and stereo components matching those stolen from the hi-fi shop. They also recovered the firearms used in the basement. a 38 caliber revolver, and a 25 caliber pistol. Most damning were the remaining items. Investigators found a partially empty bottle of liquid Drano and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. By the early morning hours of April 23, 1974, Dale Pierre Selby, William Andrews, and Keith Roberts were taken into custody. As the investigation continued, Orrin Walker provided critical testimony. Despite severe injuries, he was able to recount the events of the night in detail. His statements were consistent, specific, and corroborated by physical evidence at the scene. Courtney Naisbitt, though heavily sedated and in critical condition, also survived long enough to provide information that supported Orrin's account. The charges filed reflected the severity of the crimes. Dale Pierre Selby and William Andrews were charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Keith Roberts was charged with aggravated robbery and kidnapping. Prosecutors determined that although Roberts had remained in the van and had not participated in the torture or killings, he had knowingly assisted in the robbery and the unlawful detention of the victims. The trials drew national attention. In court, the prosecution presented a detailed timeline supported by physical evidence, medical testimony, and survivor accounts. The medical experts described the extent of the chemical burns caused by the liquid Drano, explaining how it destroyed tissue in the mouth, throat, and esophagus. Ballistics experts linked the recovered firearms directly to the gunshot wounds inflicted in the basement. Orrin Walker testified in person, his face permanently altered by his injuries, and his voice weakened by damage to his throat. He identified Dale Pierre Selby as the man who shot him and described the assault in the basement in clear, direct terms. His testimony became one of the most powerful elements of the case. The defense for William Andrews argued that he should not face the death penalty because he did not fire the fatal shots. His attorneys acknowledged his role in the robbery, but attempted to distance him from the murders themselves. The prosecution rejected this argument. They presented evidence that Andrews had held victims at gunpoint, helped bind them, assisted in forcing them to ingest the caustic liquid, and applied duct tape over their mouths. Under the law, his participation made him equally responsible for the deaths. The jury agreed. Dale Pierre Selby and William Andrews were both convicted on all major counts and sentenced to death. Keith Roberts was convicted of aggravated robbery and kidnapping and received a lengthy prison sentence. The convictions did not end the case. Appeals followed, particularly in the case of William Andrews. His attorneys challenged the constitutionality of his death sentence under the law of parties, arguing that capital punishment should be reserved only for the individual who directly caused the deaths. These appeals moved through state courts and eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. The courts consistently upheld the convictions and sentences. Judges ruled that Andrews' active participation in the events leading to the deaths made him legally culpable. Meanwhile, the survivors continued their recovery. Orrin Walker underwent multiple surgeries and lived with permanent injuries for the rest of his life. Courtney Naisbitt survived a gunshot wound to the head and extensive internal chemical damage. His survival was considered a medical rarity, though he suffered permanent neurological impairment and long-term health complications. Years passed as the legal process continued. Keith Roberts was eventually paroled in 1987, having served time for his role in the robbery and kidnappings. That same year, Dale Pierre Selby's appeals were exhausted. On August 28, 1987, 13 years after the murders, Dale Pierre Selby was executed by lethal injection at the Utah State Prison. According to witnesses, he showed no visible remorse for his crimes. William Andrews' legal challenges continued for several more years, keeping the case alive in the courts and in the public consciousness. His execution was ultimately scheduled for the summer of 1992. In the years following Dale Pierre Selby's execution, the hi-fi shop murders remained a painful and unresolved wound for many in Ogden. The case was not only remembered for the number of victims, but for the methodical cruelty involved and the extraordinary survival of Orrin Walker and Courtney Naisbitt. While one of the perpetrators had been executed, the legal process surrounding William Andrews continued to draw attention and debate. Andrews' attorneys continued to argue that his death sentence was unjust because he had not fired the fatal shots. They claimed that executing him under the law of parties blurred the line between direct action and participation. Prosecutors maintained that Andrews' role was essential to the crime. Evidence presented at trial showed that he had helped bind the victims, held them at gunpoint, assisted in forcing them to ingest the liquid Drano, and sealed their mouths with duct tape. Without his participation, the murders could not have occurred as they did. The courts consistently agreed with the prosecution. Andrews' appeals were denied at every level, including federal review. His execution date was ultimately set for July 30th, 1992. On that day, William Andrews was executed by lethal injection at the Utah State Prison. His execution drew protests from death penalty opponents, some of whom argued that his sentence was disproportionate to his actions. For the victims' families, the execution marked the end of a legal process that had stretched nearly 2 decades. Andrews made no statement that brought closure to those affected by the crime. With the executions complete, the criminal case formally ended, but the consequences of April 22nd, 1974 did not. Orrin Walker lived for more than 25 years after the attack. He endured permanent facial damage, loss of hearing in one ear, and chronic complications related to his injuries. Despite this, he became known not as a victim, but as a survivor whose presence in court ensured accountability. His decision to remain silent and feign death in the basement directly led to the survival of Courtney Naisbitt and the identification of the killers. Orrin Walker died in the year 2000. Courtney Naisbitt survived a gunshot wound to the head and severe chemical burns to his throat and esophagus. His recovery required extensive medical intervention, and he lived with lasting neurological and physical impairments. His survival was frequently described by doctors as extraordinary. Courtney Naisbitt died in 2002, having lived nearly 3 decades beyond the night that claimed his mother and friends. Carol Naisbitt, Stanley Walker, and Sherry Ansley were remembered by their families and community for the lives they were just beginning to live. Stanley Walker was a young man known for responsibility and dependability. Sherry Ansley was weeks away from graduating high school, with plans for her future abruptly ended. Carol Naisbitt was a mother whose only intention that night was to find her son. The hi-fi shop never reopened after the murders. The building stood for years as a reminder of the crime before eventually being demolished. No business replaced it that carried the same name, and the address became permanently associated with one of the most infamous crimes in Utah history. The hi-fi murders left a lasting impact on law enforcement practices, courtroom discussions surrounding accomplice liability, and the public understanding of how quickly a planned robbery can escalate into mass murder. The case remains cited in legal discussions about capital punishment and shared culpability. More than anything, the case endures because it defies simple explanation. The crime was not driven by desperation, financial need, or sudden rage. It unfolded through planning, opportunity, and a willingness to inflict suffering without necessity. Every victim in the basement complied. Every item of value had already been taken. The violence continued regardless. Today, the hi-fi murders are remembered as one of the most brutal crimes in American history, not because of spectacle, but because of intent. It stands as a reminder that extreme violence does not always announce itself with chaos or panic. Sometimes it arrives calmly, deliberately, and with devastating finality. This account exists to preserve the truth of what happened in that basement on April 22nd, 1974, and to honor those whose lives were taken. Stanley Walker, Sherry Ansley, Carol Naisbitt, their names matter. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.